Ok, bom dia.
Bom dia, pessoal. Estamos aqui de novo para o nosso segundo dia de minicurso com a professora Jeanne Dubino. E hoje nós temos a alegria de termos aqui Ingrid e Ana Sara, são alunas do curso de inglês da UFAC, e elas vão me ajudar a mediar a conversa hoje com a professora Jeanne. Ressaltando, inclusive, que a Ingrid é minha orientanda do PIBIC, é importante dizer isso, que tem realizado pesquisas comigo sobre Virginia Woolf e Radcliffe Hall, questões de gênero e sexualidade, que, inclusive, dialoga muito com o que a professora Jeanne Dubino vai falar hoje. E a Ana Sara também tem demonstrado interesse por escritoras como Alice Bechdel, escritas indígenas, gênero e sexualidade, decolonialidade, que também dialoga muito com tudo que tem sido debatido aqui. Bom, então, Ingrid, Ana Sara, let's get started.
Ok, bom dia, pessoal. É um prazer, né? It's a pleasure to be here. Então, para introduzir um pouquinho, né, sobre a nossa professora aqui, a Jeanne, ela é professora de literaturas em inglês, estudos globais e estudos animais na Appalachian State University, na Carolina do Norte dos Estados Unidos.
Ela foi professora assistente, visitante de literatura e história das mulheres na Bilkent University, na Turquia, como pesquisadora da Fulbright na Egerton University, em Quênia, e como especialista Fulbright na Universidade do Nordeste da China, e professora visitante na Universidade em Shams, no Egito.
E algumas de suas publicações mais recentes, né, incluem a organização de Virginia Woolf and the Literature Marketplace, de 2020, e as co-organizações de Represent the Modern Animal in Culture, de 2014.
Também Politics, Mobility and Identity.
Hello, motor.
Travel Writing, de 2015. Virginia Woolf, Critical and Primary Sources, de 2020.
Bom, ela também atualmente trabalha um livro, né, sobre cachorros de rua na literatura.
Isso mesmo. E hoje vai ser um debate mais sobre a questão de disabilities na literatura.
Okay, so thank you, Ana. Thank you, Ingrid. Jeanne, the stage is yours.
Hello, everybody. Bom dia. Thank you so much for this invitation. Many thanks to Professor Victor. Thank you, Ingrid y Ana. Thank you also, Maria Aparecida, who I know started her career in Brazil and is now in and here in João Pessoa. So I'm really happy to talk about literature and disabilities. So I start with here's the title, We Were Told of Disabilities. This is the title of a poem, or at least part of a poem, by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So I will explain that later. So let me get started here. Let me go to the slide, the first slide. So I know that I can't see your faces. I can't see who's present here. But if we were face to face, I would like you to think about the word disabilities. What do you think of? What are some of the disabilities that come to mind? And so I'll just ask you to reflect just really briefly on some of the disabilities, and you may put them in the chat. I won't see them till here. I won't hide the chat. I'll show the chat. But if you think of any, just kind of write them down and contemplate what they are. So with that being the case, I have composed a list of some disabilities that we consider when we think of disabilities. And the first kind might be physical. One of the first things I think of is when I see someone in a wheelchair. That seems to be the most obvious kind, the kind that we can see. For example, paraplegia, the loss of legs, or quadriplegia, the loss of the use of all limbs. Next on the list, and again, this isn't necessarily hierarchical, but one often thinks of impaired senses. Above all, the loss of sight, the loss of hearing, and other kinds of physical disabilities that get in the way of what one might call normal functioning. And that word normal is going to be addressed in a lot more detail as I move along. But chronic pain will stop people from functioning. I have a number of students, I don't know why this is so common, who have Crohn's disease, which affects their bowels. I don't know why, but it definitely impedes their functioning, and it's difficult. Disease now in the U.S., addiction, all manner of addiction. One especially thinks of alcohol, but there are also drugs. And as I was researching this for this presentation, I learned that size can be a disability, particularly dwarfism, that is being too short, and interestingly looks in some cultures at some times in some societies. So yeah, and we'll talk more about that. And then there are the cognitive disabilities, the ones that one may not necessarily see. Dementia is a big one around the world, especially as the global population is getting older. But we think of dementia with elderly people, or sometimes it strikes early. Another one that is common among young people in particular, but apparently there are a number of middle-aged and older people who experience attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, learning disabilities, anxiety. I had read in the newspaper that the current generation of university students, the ones aged 18 through 22 or thereabouts, give or take a few years, are apparently the most anxious generation on the face of the planet. And when I told my students this, they said, oh yes, that's true, at least true for them. Depression, those on the autism spectrum, those with personality disorders, and cognitive, stuttering could kind of fall in between cognitive and physical. So these are just, this is just kind of a range, and there are more that one can put on the list. So how do disabilities studies factor into literary studies? So that is, the thesis of the question that shapes this presentation. Well, when we think about literature, we believe, those of us in literary studies think, that literature is about, or at least it should be about, the lives that all of us live. That is, literature ideally should be inclusive. And so if we are to be inclusive, we need to take into account, and now I'm moving into the second bullet point, the 15% of the world's population that is said to be disabled in one way or another. So if you figure that the world's population is over 8 billion, that's close to 1 billion, all right, not too close, but close to 1 billion. That's a lot of people. So disability is a part of many people's lives. And we'll get into short-term disability, long-term disability later in the presentation. But the we, and of course, when one uses the word we want to think, those of us using the word we, want to think about inclusion. Who is in the we? So this we includes paying attention to the 15% who have, until the last, say, 40 years or so, 50 years, have been often left out of the discussion. So what does disability studies do? It provides a framework, a perspective, an awareness. So the next item on the list is what's called crip time. And that word crip is and was a huge insult until fairly recently, when those in the disability rights movement took the word crip and wore it with pride. It's almost like the queer movement. Think about how the word queer used to be used, at least in English, as a term of insult. I mean, there's also with gender and feminism, the slut walk, the slut movement, the word bitch, which I still have a hard time with, but wearing words that had been used as a term of aspersion with pride. So what does crip time refer to? Well, if you have ever used crutches, for example, you know that it takes longer to move from one place to another. So when you have so many disabilities, any one of a range, you find that it takes longer to do anything. So with that perspective of disabilities, you're aware that it takes longer to do things. So crip time means slowing things down. I know that, referring to crutches, when I had to use them once after a car accident, that I was actually hit and run over by a truck while I was walking. Anyway, I'm totally fine now, but I had to use crutches, and I remember walking down the hallway with an administrator, and he was so impatient with how slowly I moved, because using crutches is actually difficult. And I registered that impatience, and I thought, oh, okay. Anyway, those in disability studies note how to them disability seems to be everywhere. And that's an observation I learned from Janet Lyon, who has written a lot about literary disability studies. But literary disability studies certainly examines literature. However, as you will see, it is deeply concerned and mindful of the broader culture at large, right? Including, for example, in the US, how people with disabilities are one of the largest minority groups. So I mentioned the US, and that makes me think, okay, I'm in Brazil now. What is the position in Brazil? So I went to the National Survey of Health, and I have the website down here, which was then cited in this website here, which looked like a legitimate site, and learned that as of 2019, 8.4% of the population, which at the time included 17.3 million people aged 2 or over, had one of the disabilities that were investigated, including visual, hearing, mental, and limb impairment. That 28.3% of people with pessoas with disabilities at working age, 14 and over, were in the workforce. So that's almost 1/3. Versus 66% of people without disabilities. So 1/3 of people with disabilities are in the workforce, and 2/3 of people without disabilities are in the workforce. And then we see in the next statistic that about 2/3 of people with disabilities did not have schooling or incomplete primary education, versus less than 1/3, just under 1/3, of people without any of the disabilities surveyed. Right. So what I will go on to do for the rest of the presentation is consider how, give a very brief snapshot history in a nutshell, to use a colloquium, of how disability studies moved from the social sciences to the humanities, and also from political activism to the humanities. I will just mention a few of the leading theorists, at least in the US. I will consider some examples of literary and cultural criticism done in disability studies. And here I refer to the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies. I will talk more about that journal. And then in the second half, I will consider sort of questions that are of interest to those of us in literature and theory. How does disability studies challenge the very idea of what is normal? What are critical disability studies? And then how to work with disability studies in terms of approaching text. What are some methodologies? So, starting with a collection of 5 books, I will start here with Irving Goffman's Stigma, published in 1963, just over 60 years ago, where he looks at how disabilities have been framed in Western, Northern, Global North, Global West cultures as abominations of the body. But these abominations are socially formed, and what stands out about stigma is how they can vary by time and place. So let's go ahead 13 years to 1976 to Michel Foucault, the history, by the way, Goffman, US American, Foucault, of course, French. In his history of sexuality, he writes about the way Foucault writes about the way bodies are seen as problems that are sequestered, all right, imprisoned in rooms, if you will, controlled, diagnosed, and otherwise socially managed. Those of you and many of in the audience know about biopolitics and how Foucault is at the forerunner of those, and this is what the definition of biopolitics. I just read a review of Foucault in one of the many magazines that I read. A new biography has come out on him. His father was a doctor. He lived down the street from a mental institution. You can see an asylum. You can see how much his childhood informed his adult work. I always love to read about how people came to be interested in the topics that they pursue in their lives. Next, jumping ahead 2 years to Leslie Fiedler's Freaks, he considers the people's fascination with non-normative bodies, and he considers them in the realm of capitalism, how they have been used for profit. In the US, there used to be many what are called freak shows, and there has been a real fascination with them in the US and throughout Europe, and I've been told that that's also true in some parts of Brazil. Now, I'm truly jumping ahead 32 years to 2010 with Dan Goodley's Disability Studies, and he comes up with the phrase critical disability studies and considers how disability is associated with discrimination and inequality. So whenever you use that word critical before studies, of course, the conversation shifts to questions of power, imbalances, inequality, and basically tend to be allied with Marxism. And then finally, Tanya Tchaikovsky's word normal and keywords for disability studies. By the way, my library has this book. It's a very useful book. And I am happy to send you chapters if you can't access it through your databases. But she's the one who helped to popularize the idea of how disability overlaps with other isms. So disability studies wants to contend with ableism, that is favoring bodies that are able over bodies that are quote unquote non-able, as in disabled. And so she looks at the idea of intersectionality and how ableism overlaps with other isms like racism, sexism, ageism, homophobia, not exactly an ism, and other forms of human diminishment that position some humans on the edges of belonging. So this is just a snapshot history of social sciences. Now I'm going to move to historical movements and the political context. So yesterday I gave a talk on animal studies, and what I did not say there, for those of you who are there, is in some ways animal studies is a part of eco-criticism, concern for the environment, which came out of the civil rights movements in the US. I'm talking about the US here, the civil rights movements of the 1960s. And so out of the hard work by disability rights activists, we have laws that start to be enacted, including the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which was the first disability civil rights law. And then in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, which has done so much, not enough, but so much to help transform the landscape and make life easier for people with disabilities. However, what we find through things like the universal design movement is that what makes life easier for people with disabilities makes life easier for all of us. Think about curbs that slant from sidewalks to the road. Now we can use our wheelie suitcases, our shopping carts, those of us who are able. Think about subtitles. So many of us have gotten spoiled, even in the US, we keep subtitles on, even with movies in English, though English is our first language, speaking of us in the US. In 2008, the UN met to declare the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And here's a quotation from that. Disability results from the interaction between persons with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinders their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So you can see how the conception of disability is based on is a product of both the social environment and the body. And we'll keep getting back to that. So what is happening in Brazil? In 2008, it became a signatory to the convention, right, and ratified the treaty through legislative decree 186. It was then promulgated in 2009, and there was then a law followed 7 years later in 2016, whereby states parties shall take all appropriate measures, including legislation, to modify or abolish existing laws, regulations, customs, and practices that constitute discrimination against persons with disabilities, right? And we see this law 2016. I had showed you the actual current state as of 2019. So sometimes it takes a while between the implementation, between the law and its implementation. So now I'd like to move to the second part, to the leading journal and a few theorists. I had mentioned the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies. It was established in 2007. It comes out of the UK, published by Liverpool University Press. And there are now growing journals around the world, which is a good thing, like the European Union Journal of Disability Studies. But some of the leading critics are, especially and above all, Leonard J. Davis, who has written a number of books. And I bring this one up here, even though it's only one of several I could have mentioned, because I'm intrigued by his title, Bending Over Backwards, Disability, Dismodernism, and Other Difficult Positions. Dismodernism is a term new to me. This is not a book I have looked at, but I just discovered it as I was reviewing my presentation last week. Martha Stoddard Holmes is somebody whom I actually got to teach with for 1 year, who has done phenomenal work on the representation of disability in Victorian literature and Victorian culture. Fictions of affliction, physical disability, and Victorian culture. And I want to point to the title of Bolt and Donaldson and Rotis's co-edited book, The Mad Woman and the Blind Man. One of the biggest go-to books is Jane Eyre, which, if you haven't read it yet, don't want to give the plot away, but you will see what the title means when you do read it. All right, so here are some special issues from the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies. Here's one of the first special issues, Cripping Graphic Medicine, Approaching Comics from a Disability Studies Perspective. And so that one would be of special interest to those who study graphic fiction, graphic novels. I know that sometimes I start my classes with graphic novels as a way of drawing students into the class. They're keenly interested in comics, and comic books and graphic fiction can do so much in terms of representation. The second one is definitely an intersectional approach to disability, rethinking the species divide, disability and animality, and literature and culture. And then this third one is of intriguing cripistemologies. Now, so you can see the word cripistemology is what we would call a portmanteau word or a suitcase word, combining two words together, crip and then epistemology. What is epistemology? Ways of knowing. How do those with disabilities? And notice I keep saying those with disabilities, people with disabilities. We no longer, of course, say disabled people, because that is to define, and I'm telling you what you already know, to define people in terms of their disabilities. It's only one part, but toward a cripistemology of eco-anxiety. One of my friends is a therapist, and so many of the people whom she works with, who are her patients, the word that is often used as clients, are really anxious about the state of the world, are deeply anxious about global climate change, and suffer from eco-anxiety. And so how do people who have eco-anxiety see the world? And here are a few other titles from this collection: Cripistemologies of Memory, and there should be a comma here, Dementia, Disappearance, and Mourning. All right. When you start to develop dementia and you're in the early stages, you start to mourn that which you had, that is memory and ability to reason in deep ways. And it's very depressing. Next, cripistemologies of drug use against trans-institutional carceral ableism. So here you can again see more intersectionality, looking at carceralism in jails. The U.S. happens to imprison an enormous percentage of its population. Our population is around 330 million, give or take. I would say give about maybe 3 million. We imprison over 2 million people. And many of those actually are people with disabilities, particularly mental disabilities. And so there are so many issues when one thinks about the population who are incarcerated in the US. And then moving on to the final bullet point, invitation to dance, performing disability politics through the dancing body. Yesterday, I had mentioned that Mikhail Baryshnikov performed in a ballet based on Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, about Gregor Samson, the main character, who is turned into a giant bug. And you could almost sort of see that as somebody performing disability, a man who is turned into an insect. All right. And so the next 3 slides are just going to be a range of titles that have appeared in this Journal of Disability Studies. And I am only giving you a kind of sense of the kind of work that is being done by scholars around the world on disability, so that you can get a feel and an awareness of how popular this kind of study is. So I'd like to start here with Mara Brady's Disabled Milton, a Genealogy. John Milton, 17th century British poet, who started to go blind as he was writing his great works. What does that mean? Moving along to Benjamin Hiramatsu, Ireland's A Frenchman in Tokyo, Theology of Disability and Cultural Ableism, and Endo Shisaku's Wonderful Fool. And so we have here travel literature and the theology and cultural studies. You can see how it's so difficult to do literary disability studies without thinking about culture and other kinds of other dimensions of culture. Angelo Moreta, Canadian critic, his pieces on doing disability movies differently, representing disability through a short film. So you can see that disability, literary disability studies broadly encompasses film along with literature. Here's Rachel Kolb's Deaf People's Subtle Art, Mabel Bell, Textual Deduction, and Cultural Representations of Lip Reading. Again, these titles make you feel like you want to read the Journal of Cultural and Disability Studies from front to cover. John William Fessenden's Hazardous Futures and Damned Embodiments, Disability and White Masculinization in Science Fiction Film. Octavia Butler does represent a lot of disability, and science fiction made me think of her work. And I think about, the range of genres. I see this word masculinization. If you think about stereotypical definitions of masculinity, they are all kind of based on the idea of power and strength and the perfectly performing body. And white adds to that. And so how can you kind of critique white masculinization? I know now when I teach some of my cultural studies classes, some of the favorite units that my students appreciate are masculinities and masculinity studies around the world. And so anyway, this title stood out for me. Here we have Crystal Yin Leah's A Temporal Stuttering, Dementia, and Disaster, and Ruth Ozeki's A Tale for the Time Being. I mention this also because Ruth Ozeki is a Japanese US writer who is just wonderful, and I definitely advocate that you read her. And again, reminder that dementia is a disability. Here we move to another part of the world, Amel Abadi's Intersections of Masculinity, and Khaled Hosseini's A Thousand Splendid Suns, and Layla Abuleila's Lyrics Alley. Deep interest in disability studies in the Middle East. You can see that too with Shad Al-Shamari's literary and cultural depictions of multiple sclerosis in Kuwait, a reading of 3 texts. And with the next title, Hentil Yaps to Free Speech, From Free Speech, Marxism, Mediation, and Disability Studies in Hu Hassal Hussein's A City of Sadness. Here is a Taiwanese author by The Critical Approach is by another Taiwanese author. Delia Steverson, US writer, writes about slavery and representation in a book about slavery, Dolores Phillips, The Darkest Child, Deaf, Race and Labor. And then moving now to the South Asia, Islam Muhaiminul's Textus Cultural Archive, a close reading of Madan Vashista's Deaf in Delhi, and memoir. And I'm going to talk a little bit about memoirs and how they're so prominent in disability studies. Now moving along to Eastern Europe, here we have Ina Dimitrova's Labor is Our Song, Deaf in the Bulgarian Socialist Work Utopia. David Bolt's You're Just Little, How Participatory Photography Can Raise Awareness About the Everyday Experiences of Dwarfism. Emma Shepard's Chronic Pain as Emotion. And here we have Sammy Schalk's Wounded Warriors. In the US, I love my country, the country where I was born, of which I am a citizen. I'm not happy about the number of wars we fight. We have military bases. We have over 800 military bases around the world. We fund a lot of wars. We fund both sides. Our military-industrial complex benefits greatly from them. And a lot of people go and fight and come back and are indeed wounded warriors. I have a number of veterans in my classes, and they are indeed wounded. If you think about the Vietnam War alone, over 50,000 US soldiers died, and then many more returned. Out of the many who returned, 60,000 have actually committed suicide. So you can see that war not only affects those who are killed. Let's not forget the 2 million Vietnamese who were killed. And I think that has to deeply be acknowledged. But that kind of activity, being a soldier, has a deep impact on the soldiers themselves. And so we see a lot of literature by and about soldiers. And then next, the Bodies That Count by Diane Carr, Augmentation, Community, and Disability in a Science Fiction Game. And then Will Kanyusik's Eugenic Nostalgia, Self-Narration, and Internalized Ableism, and Kasura Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go. Okay, so moving along to the fourth category, how do disability studies challenge the very idea of what is normal? So if you remember nothing else from this presentation, remember that disability studies work against normal versus abnormal. Disability is not only a medical problem located in an individual's body. Disability studies tends to reject medicalization and rather focus on how disability is socially constructed. And it considers the structures that name or identify disability. For example, how disability is seen as a punishment from God. And that is still often the case in many cultures around the world. It certainly was the case until somewhat recently. The eugenics movement was very prominent in setting up this dichotomous system of normal and abnormal, and sought to kind of do away with quote unquote abnormal bodies by, for example, sterilizing women who were considered to fall outside the mainstream of society, or sequestering bodies that were not considered normal. The eugenics movement really started in the Western Hemisphere, the global North, global Northwest, you could say, Western Europe, the US, toward the end of the 19th century, very widespread at the beginning of the 20th, and finally, fortunately, lost steam. But what was not fortunate is that what kind of put somewhat of an end to the eugenics movement was Hitler and his treatment of bodies, particularly bodies that did not fit that Aryan ideal. Unfortunately, I think we're starting to see a bit of a rise again of eugenics movement with what is called CRISPR gene editing, whereby parents can kind of design their children. So what will happen in the future remains to be seen. There's also a European US orientation on disability that seeks to make bodies that are considered disabled to be independent. And if you think about many parts of the world where independence and autonomy are not as normalized or idealized, you can see that this kind of striving may not work. And so disability rights movements are really also about, looking at those bodies in certain cultures and looking at how those cultures work to define or socialize ideas of what is normal and abnormal. I had referred at the end of this list to the universal design movement, which is about trying to enable autonomy and so on. What the disability studies movement does is it tries to move away from stigma. Remember those books that I had shown you where stigma was in the title, but move away from stigma and from inspiring fear and pity and the image of the supercrip toward awareness, acceptance, and integration, so that disability just becomes another mode of difference. And I find that my students tend to be drawn to the disability studies perspective because they themselves feel so different and so not like other students in the university. And they like the idea that we all have different kinds of difference, and it makes you feel less alone. But I want to look at this word supercrip. How is this defined? And many of you may know it, so apologies for those of you who are aware of this term. But that refers to the way people who have disabilities may not only be treated as somehow less than those with quote unquote able bodies, but people who have disabilities may be treated as even more special. And so if you look at those who are shunted to a margin, those who are considered super crips are said to be even better than those who are able-bodied. I think of someone like Oscar Pretorius, who, by the way, just got out of jail for killing his girlfriend. But he is missing the lower half of his legs, and he's quite a phenomenal runner. A super crip might also refer to someone who mountain climbs and is blind, and so that kind of to call someone a super crip is another way of othering that person, that PASOA. So what does critical disability studies do? It's focused on power differentials. I mean, disability studies does that too, but particularly critical disability studies, it opposes hierarchy. Even within the disability rights movements, where it considers how white disabled people, at least in the US, tend to get more attention than ethnic minorities with disabilities. And the way, for example, people in wheelchairs users may receive more consideration than those with cognitive disabilities. Anyone who studies modernist literature and places it within the context of modernist literature may know, for example, that World War I or Great War soldiers in Western Europe returned to civilian life, and many of these suffered from what was then called shell shock and now is called post-traumatic stress syndrome. They did not get the kind of attention as those who received visible injuries. And so critical disability studies looks at that. And so did Virginia Woolf, by the way. So there are also debates on universality, the universality of disability. And there are some who claim, who are in disability studies, that all of us are only temporarily able-bodied. Our bodies are vulnerable. If we reach old age, we will experience a loss of full bodily function. We may, a third of us may develop dementia, or actually will develop some form of dementia. So it may be that we are all temporarily able-bodied. I mean, we're only one accident away from, developing or incurring disabilities. But the thought with some in critical disability studies is that to say we are TAB or temporarily able-bodied may erase those with who experience lifelong discrimination. And to say that we are all temporarily able-bodied may mute the effectiveness of activism. So these are some of the things to consider. So now I'd like to move into disability studies in terms of approaching text. All right, what are some methodologies? So here I'm back to Leonard J. Davis, who in his 1995 book, Enforcing Normalcy. But let me just look at that date, 1995. You saw from that slide earlier on that those in sociology and in cultural studies really started at the beginning of the 1960s, and their work intensified. In literature, the work picked up from the work that was being done by sociologists and also by those in politics. And literary studies started to respond really in the 1990s, and that's where you start to see a big pickup. And so now in 2024, there are many articles, and you saw that from the Journal of Literary and Cultural Studies. So anyway, the fascinating thing about enforcing normalcy is how that Davis writes about is how this word normal arose in the industrial age. Before the idea was the normal. If you think about industry, it's about standardization. Capitalism is about efficiency. We start to see we start to see assembly lines where each person does one thing. The word normal is associated with progress. I noticed that even on Brazil's flag, the slogan is order and progress. The normal is also associated with eugenics. Let's create a world in which we're all, quote unquote, normal. There are no more abnormalities. So what Davis writes about is the way novels feature ordinary or normal, non-heroic citizens. Characters with disabilities come to occupy marginal roles, like Tiny Tim, who is, quote unquote, a dwarf, is now marginalized, for example, in Dickens' tale, A Christmas Carol. Right? Rosemary Garland Thomas is a very major figure in disability studies. In her book, Extraordinary Bodies, Figuring Physical Disability in American Culture and Literature, she comes up with the term normate, which is an idealized position that has dominance and authority in society. All right. And then here's another book that may join us to consider ways of working with narrative. So they write about how disability can be used as a tool, a narrative device to reaffirm normalcy. And so they want us to be aware of how disability is used, not to call attention to itself or develop sympathy, but as simply a tool. So they consider how in some novels like Moby Dick, all right, that's their go-to text. This is about Moby Dick, how we start off with the narrator, the writer, author, Melville, starts off with an explanation of the disability, which inaugurates the narrative act, and then provides an account of the consequences of the disability. It brings the disability from the margin to the center of the story. And then what follows is a cure, rehabilitation, or elimination of the deviance in some way, which then restores a sense of order. So what Mitchell and Snyder's argument is that those who are represented as having disabilities should not just be used as a prosthesis, like a prosthesis limb, to reaffirm the normal. As critics, what we should do is be mindful of how disability is used. We should, that is, enunciate how ability is used as an ideology, or the ideology of disability, or ideology of ability. And we should look at how ability becomes the baseline by which humanness is determined. But as critics, move the margin to the center, and be mindful of this narrative kind of progression, and show how, make the case that humanness should not just be based on what is ability. And Otto Quason, in Aesthetic Nervousness, he looks at 9 functions of disability in text, and I'm just going to look at 3 of those 9. Often disabled characters are not the moral characters. They reveal the morality of other characters, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Often disability, and this is where we get into intersectionality, race overlaps with racial, sexual, economic, and other forms of social otherness. And critics today, you can see this was published in 2007, are especially keenly interested in how disability is often affiliated with queerness as well. Disability will sometimes represent moral deficit or evil. So someone the other week noted to me how the evil characters in James Bond, almost all, in fact, they all have disabilities. So I Googled this last night, and I went to Reddit, apologies for that, or rather Quora. And here is Richard Sample. He says that he's a former IT assistant, and he writes about Ian Fleming, how he seemed to be obsessed with medical and physical defects, not to mention, well, if some flaws that seem outrageously on PC, he says, don't blame me. And so he composed this long list. This is only part of the list, the first part of the list, where he looks at the evil characters, the bad guys, the guys in the bad hat, who all, as he goes on to list, have flaws. Dr. No lost his hands to radiation, wears metal claws. Red Grant, homicidal paranoiac, paranoid. Here we have a sociopath, Krylenko. Rosa Klebb, a lesbian, which would certainly put her outside of the norm, at least in the 1960s. Goldfinger is fat. Think about the fat rights movement. Ginger-haired, something off about that. Objob is mute. In the book, he eats cats. Emilio Largo, eye patch, etc. And the list goes on and on and on. There are so many James Bond movies. And you think about that as a global genre. So anyway, I thought I would mention that. And then I want to look at an overlapping studies that overlaps with disability studies, trauma studies, that often, like disability studies, starts with origination. How did the subject become traumatized? And that's where Wounded Warrior also figures into trauma studies. Then we have the explanation that follows, and often trauma studies show disruption between the past and the present, between the self and the others, memory, and this takes us back to Broken Hero. So that in itself is, and if you think about trauma studies, that can also figure into studies like age studies and, dementia studies, and, life before and after the loss of memory. I think of several films like Iris, about Iris Murdoch, who, a brilliant British author who lived in the middle, who was very popular in the middle of the 20th century. The movie Iris is about how she developed dementia. Then there's another movie, Alice with Juliana Moore, about developing early onset Alzheimer's. And then moving on to disability studies, approaching text. What kind of text can we read? And we can look at canonical ones and how disability, it may be a marginal feature or a marginalized feature of the novel, but as critics, we can move it to the center. Or texts that foreground disabilities. And that's where memoirs are so key, because memoirs can be all about disability. Or one can look at texts by authors with disabilities, whether they acknowledge them or not. For example, in the 18th century, Alexander Pope, who is a brilliant poet, he had a hunchback. To what extent did he acknowledge his own short stature? Well, he didn't really. But one might think about, well, did it figure if you're going to do a biographical approach into his text? So did he acknowledge them or did he not? Or one can look at post-colonial text. And again, there's so many one can look at. And this is a reminder of how disability is socially formed and how it changes across cultures. So in that book that I told you about, Keywords for Disability Studies, in their introduction, Disability, Adams, Rice, and Serlin, they refer to how in Botswana there's an ethos of communal care, all right, which is great, but there may not be such an interest in trying to create a world where everyone has autonomy, because the belief is none of us have autonomy. But then they write that there's an intense aversion to certain types of bodily disfigurement or unruliness. And so you have to kind of be mindful of that kind of representation in some post-colonial authors. So let me just consider a few canonical texts. As I had told you, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, published 1847, features three different kinds of disabilities: mental illness, something happens to an eye, something happens to an arm. Don't want to give the plot away, but this is a text that gets taught over and over again in schools, at least in the US. And so there's so much you can do in terms of analyzing this text. I went on during COVID time, I went on an Anthony Trollope binge. He was a British novelist. And I was really interested in the way he wrote a fair amount about alcoholism. And it was not just marginalized. And then after Trollope, I was reading a lot of Émile Zola, French novelist, who also wrote about alcoholism and how much that really affected the lives of everyone who lived in the community. And I was so taken by that. And of course, there was so much alcoholism in the 19th century. You couldn't trust the water. Life was hard. So many turned to alcoholism. E.M. Forster, early 20th century novelist, wrote about frailty in his book, The Longest Journey. Juna Barnes, in her book of Repulsive Women at the beginning of the 20th century, wrote about ugliness as a disability. And I had never heard of this ugliness as a disability, so I looked a little bit into it. And I learned that in some communities in the United States at the end of the 19th century, that there were bylaws whereby those who were considered ugly were not allowed to be physically present in the community. They were utterly marginalized. I had never heard of ugliness as a disability. Woolf writes about disability, and it appears in a number of her novels. I think I unfortunately removed the slide there, but in one of her early novels, her third novel, Jacob's Room, we see missing fingers and an invalid. All right, they just kind of slide into the novel. A novel that is often taught in the U.S., a U.S. novel by the great writer John Steinbeck, writes about developmental delay, not marginalized. And now I'm jumping ahead to the second half of the 20th century in the U.S. Scott Momaday, Native American indigenous writer in the U.S., writes about impaired walking in Housemaid of Dawn. Leslie Marmon Silko, a wounded warrior, PTSD and ceremony. Anita Desai, Indian writer, Clear Light of Day, alcoholism. And then there's David Lodge, who in his novel, he's a British novelist, who wrote a biographical novel called Death Sentence, which is about the onset of his own deafness. And he calls this a novel, but he writes about his hearing loss. He's also a novelist and a literary critic, but he's a novelist who wrote a number of parodies about the academic life. And this book is written in that comic vein. And so these novels do not just take on a tragic tone, but a kind of normalizing tone and a comedic tone as well. All right. Oh, I did include Virginia Woolf. Good. So here, for all the Woolf scholars in the room, here are six essays, 6 articles on Woolf. Sorry, I thought I had moved it. But some of the approaches: wotering, intervening bodies, disability, queerness, and crypt theory, and Woolf's on being ill, Mrs. Dalloway, and Orlando. Wow, what an approach. Very intersectional, very rich. David Galeff, his disfigured figures, Virginia Woolf's disabled list, is it's a short piece, but it's a really interesting piece that reminds us that Virginia Woolf saw disabled people with disabilities all around her, and she factors them into her novels. Sebastian Williams' Anthropocentric Ableism and Virginia Woolf's Flesh, a really interesting essay where he writes about how being an animal, non-human animal, is a form of disability. So we can see that in this fascinating piece. Maren Linnet examines deformity in Virginia Woolf's The Years. And she also looks at the way deform appears over and over again in this novel. Matt Frank's Serving on the Eugenic Home Front, Virginia Woolf, Race and Disability, and then Cara DeMeester's Trauma and Recovery and Mrs. Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. So those are some of examples that you're encouraged to look at, and I do have access to so many of these. So I thought then, as far as literary studies go, that if it's all right with you, Victor, we could talk about this. We can remove the we could think about this poem and maybe talk about it a little more during the Q&A. But this is actually not the whole poem. It's only a stanza from the poem. I think perhaps many of you have read it, but it's by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who writes about the way women are told that they do not want the vote. The women do not want it, they are told. And so the we of the poem is a response to the men who say that women do not want the vote. So in the US, women got the vote after much struggle in 1920, and in the UK in 1919, and most women, all women got the vote in 1929. And so in this particular stanza, which is about 4 stanzas into the poem, we see that the word disabilities comes up. And we see how the very, very fact of being women is to be disabled. And so truly intersectional, all right? We were told of disabilities, a long array of these. And notice the passive voice, again, the speaker is responding to this man. Oh, by the way, and notice the date of publication of this poem, 1897. A long array of these. So you get the feeling that this guy is droning on and on and on, till one would think that womanhood was merely a disease, because perhaps in a patriarchal world it is. And the maternal sacrifice was added to the plan, and this becomes a disability as well, right? In fact, you think about Western medicine, women who are pregnant and who do go to the hospital, one could sort of see how pregnancy is kind of added to the list of diseases, as if you need to expel the body before your body can return to quote unquote normal. And then we have sacrifice then gets added to the various sacrifices we have always made to man. So I guess I chose this because it's a short stanza. We have this word disability, disease, very intersectional, and I know that there is a lot more we can say about this one stanza. But I think about, too, when we discuss poems, we think about tone. And what is the tone of this one? Much more one can say. This is the beauty of poetry. You know how all of us teachers in the room and students too, we can spend the entire 50, 75 minutes in a short class on a single poem. But the tone is sardonic, it's angry. So we can talk more about that in the Q&A. And then the next poem, and I think this is one that many of you are familiar with, Anne Bradstreet, great American poet, US American poet from the 17th century. Here, this is from the author to her book, published around 1650. And you'll see a very different kind of tone. You will also see more language of disability. And you will see, tone, language of disability. So the I is, of course, the author here. Not necessarily Anne Bradstreet, but any of us who have ever written anything at all. And the thy is the addressee, and the thy face could be the book, all right? But then the book becomes a metaphor for a baby, as you will see. So baby book, she's delivering a book, she's writing a book, and of course, how many authors, especially female authors, feel like they are, birthing a book when they write. Right. I washed thy face, but more defects, big word in disability studies, I saw. So the more I washed thy face, the more defects I saw. So basically, I'm trying to edit, but I still see more things that are the matter with my production. And rubbing off a spot, and I don't know if the word spot meant pimple, all right, as is used in the UK now. But as I'm trying to rub this off, I still made a flaw. Here's more language of disability. Then I stretch thy joints, all right, my limbs, to make thee even feet. So the baby is lopsided. And if you know anything about the body, all of us are lopsided to one degree or another. perfectly, there's no such thing as absolutely perfect symmetry, but feet make us think of course, the feet of a poem. I stretch thy joints. This is iambic pentameter, where you put the beat on the second foot, a foot, 2 syllables. I stretch thy joints to make the even feet. So here she's trying to make her baby more symmetrical, her text more even, yet still, and notice this is not an I am, right? It's a dactyl. Thou runst more hobbling than is meet, than is fitting, than is appropriate. So no matter what I do this text, I'm making it even more lopsided, more uneven. I'm introducing more defects, and all of us who write know what that feels like. All right, so we might talk more about that poem. But I don't think this is an angry poem. It's kind of a funny poem. It's a poem about, authorial frustration, one might say. So concluding thoughts. I think that there's no better way to talk about disability through literature. Literature, as we all know, gets us to see with new eyes, especially in the classroom. We teach students about disability. They lift their head from the page and they say, oh, wow, I see this everywhere. I'm more attuned to it. I'm more sympathetic. I know that this is a Victorian approach to literature. That is, literature makes us better people, but why not? I think that it's hard to not take this third bullet point, this exciting, more intellectual pursuit, and get us to be more aware, maybe activist. Disability studies should not be considered just a narrow or specialized field, but one applicable to us all. It gets us to see that humans vary a great deal physically, mentally. I have a friend named Elizabeth who is an artist, and she went to a body sculpting class. So what this entailed was all the women in the class, there were 60, she said, in her class, they had to take off their clothes and then basically get into this sort of plaster model and create these sculptures of themselves. And Elizabeth said she really had no idea until that point how different women's breasts are, because we see sort of one kind of idealized youthful breast. And it just made her aware of the different body shapes we all have. So why not? And so the third bullet point from the end, with disability studies, we come to see that people should not be forced to conform to some kind of idealized human form that has been taken as the norm. We should think about embodiment in new ways. COVID-19 was a horrible thing that the entire world went through. But perhaps one of the silver linings is it gets us to think about not just physical disabilities, but other kinds of inequalities, race, class, age, and those with disabilities. So thank you for listening to me. I look forward to the discussion to follow. So I think we can move on to Q&A.
So we have some commentaries first before the questions. The first comment is from Professor Victor. He said that I got myself thinking about the bell jar and the bluest eye.
No, there's one.
And also he said, that reminds me of the movie Normal Heart, which approaches issues AIDS epidemic, and the main character is treated by a disabled doctor, which is played by Julia Roberts, who is a wheelchair user. We also have a comment from Gigliani Souza, and she says, when it comes to women's disability, it reminds me of Eugênia in Memórias Póstumas de Brás Cubas, A Vênus Manca. And also a comment from
My comments,
Ana
actually.
Sara.
Yes, I said that it reminds me the Victor classes, actually, because he's my professor, our professor. And we learned more about this kind of disabilities when we read The Bluest Eye and Things Fall Apart. And actually, I have a kind of question. I actually know the answer, but I really want to talk more about it because it's something that I study a lot, that is about the other. I want to ask you, in fact, we all have a kind of disability, right? Even if it's illness or something physical, or even we are part of a minority. So in fact, in the end, we are always the other. What do you think about it?
I think that one can look at it. Sorry about, I just saw the wind is blowing my hair all over the place. I think that literature allows us to get into the experience of a range of other people. And then I think that literature can cause us to, or get us ideally, to kind of reflect upon our own experiences in this world and to enlarge our sense of who gets what the mainstream is and who gets included and who doesn't. And as you were talking, is it Sarah? Or as you were talking, you got me to think about also the question of precarity and vulnerability and people who live on the street. And one might say that, well, where's the physical disability? Where's the mental? That's a choice that people make. But one could perhaps say that people who cannot find a home, all right, are in some ways disabled, because to be disabled is not just to inhabit a body, but it's to inhabit all the apparatus of society. So I think that one of the reasons I personally am very fond of literature is that it gets us to see the world around us and the people who inhabit it in a very whole kind of way. And of course, literature is about aesthetics, and it gets us to kind of see how we're constructed in language and so on. But it also gets us to use our imagination. And so I think that you also had asked about how we all, to some extent have a disability. And this is where some in the disability rights movement will say, well, yeah, but how much does it impede your ability to inhabit a certain kind of mainstream? And I think that, and so that's something to think about. But if you look at precarity and poverty and not being able to, avail yourselves of all the things that society has to offer, I think that gets you to extend the definition of what disability is, and not just look at the body, but look at the larger society. So I think that one can make that case, especially in societies that are so uneven, that prevent so many people from fully occupying and inhabiting the world around them. But I know that my students who really take to disability studies tend to be those who feel like outsiders, who like the idea that, who particularly take to the idea who particularly respond to the idea of normativity and who is normal. I think that they take comfort that normality, normateness is socially constructed. I know that answer was kind of all over the place, but I think it gets really complicated.
Yeah. We have another commenter by Jessica Alves. She's asking, as English teachers in Brazil, we have so little time to give classes. Any tips on how to include this type of subjects in our classes?
I think, first of all, to choose, insofar as you have a choice of text, choose a text that has disability, the representation, or that represents disability in one way or another, and incorporate it into the discussion and get students to think about how is the character represented in a favorable way, in an unfavorable way. How does that character fit into the narrative? To what extent is that character being marginalized or in a center? Get students to talk about where they see disability in their own lives or in their families, because in a way, how can you get away from disability? I mean, I think about how, for example, I have a niece who's on the autism spectrum. I have a brother-in-law who's on the autism spectrum. I think that all of us, we have families, we have friends who have families. Get them to think about, disability in their own lives. And a number of my students experience depression and anxiety at my university. 1 out of every 10 students goes to counseling services. And so get them to reflect on their experiences too. But I would say, insofar as you can, choose a text with a disability and then bring that up as a topic for conversation, even if it's only 5, 10, 15 minutes. Talk about it. All right. I know that when I teach global studies, I've given workshops. Well, how can I incorporate global awareness into my curricula? You can do it in a short way, a medium way, or a longer way. And so even a short way can make an impact.
Yeah.
Yes. We also have another question. It says, are there any children books that approach disabilities that you could recommend?
Oh, God. What's that book about strangers that go bump in the night? There's one by a boy who is on the autism spectrum that I might think about. And if you email me, I could look around and send a list, because there certainly are. All right. And I would imagine, English translated into Portuguese, and I would imagine that there is a range of Portuguese text. Yeah.
I also
Thank
have a
you,
question.
Jessica. Yeah.
I also have a question. I heard you comment about Franz Kafka and the Metamorphosis. And do people think that the representation of people with that this metaphor of people with disabilities as animals, linking a little bit with the last session, do like activists think that is a good way of representing, or do some people find it a bit dehumanizing? How is it viewed because it's a bit common to see disabilities being a metaphor of people turning into animals sometimes in literature?
Yeah, I mean, this is where you can really incorporate both a discussion of disability studies and animality studies. And if the disability is like in those James Bond movies that I showed you, if it's represented, if it's deliberately intended to make a character look bad, then you can bring that up to the students or be mindful of it and say, well, why? And is that a good thing? And let's address how that's happening here. And then look at perhaps other instances in culture and say, how can we fight against that? Look at Ian Fleming. I mean, what was his problem? Why does that list that I showed you was so part of a very long list. Why does he keep doing that? And why do we keep watching James Bond movies? And why are they so popular? And to get people to be mindful of how negatively disability can be represented.
Thank you very much. This was all the questions that we had for today. So thank you very much, Professor Jeanne, for your presentation today. And we thank everyone who was here. We thank Professor Victor, who helped us. And we thank Professor Maisa also, who is the coordinator of this whole event.
Yes, for the invitation for being here.
Yeah, and we thank also the invitation to be here and to mediate this amazing session.
Well, let me thank you also for mediating. Again, Professor Maisa, thank you for everybody who is here. And again, Professor Victor and Professor Maria Aparecida.
Thank you, Jeanne. We seem to not have any comments so far, any more comments. But would you like to comment on something else? Because you said that you would comment on Perkins' poem. Would you like to do that? Because we still have time.
So should I, or maybe someone in the audience, would anyone in the audience like to say more? And do you have access to the poem? I think I just saw that the curricula, the PowerPoint is on.
Yeah, it's here.
Yeah. Let's see. And then, yeah, scroll back to either Gilman's poem. Oh, should I scroll back? Let's see. I think, how do I do that? Yeah. We could either look at Bradstreet's or Gilman's. Would anyone else like to say something about that as we were, as I was reading it?
So guys, do you have any questions? We still have some time. You just write it down in the chat box. There is another comment and question by Gigliani. Professor, how do you see Frida Kahlo's piece of work? Because she portrayed a lot of her disability problems in her work.
Oh, isn't Frida Kahlo such a great go-to person? She's so hugely popular. She's become such a cultural icon. I don't know if that's true in Brazil, but in the US, she is utterly recognizable. And I think that so many of my students are drawn to her because she represents pain in such searing and powerful terms. And I think that she represents physical pain, but emotional pain. But I think about my students so typically will have posters of Kahlo, especially her self-representations. So I think that she would be in some ways ideal. Now, I don't know if you've read Amitav Ghosh's The Great Derangement, and he looks at her work versus the work of her husband, Diego Rivera, who represented another kind of pain, and that is the pain of the working class. And he gave what to me was kind of a harsh criticism of not Kahlo herself, but of the way she's been used. She represents individual pain and in such an incredible way. And he says that literature then came on to be way too individual. He said that it needs to be much more socially constructed so that we can see ourselves as part of a larger social group. That said, it might be interesting to kind of take that essay, that chapter or part of the chapter from The Great Derangement and ask students what they think. But I can tell you that Frida Kahlo would be a really great that, a strategy of, talking about disability. Yeah.
Very interesting, Giuliani. And I'm really interested in this extended understanding of disabilities, because as you said, since it's culturally constructed, how we get to comprehend like intersectionality, of course, considering how some groups of peoples are constructed as disabled, like Black people, queer people, indigenous people, and especially when we consider the queer community when we talk about trans people, because they are not considered to perform or to do certain jobs, right? They don't have this chance in most cases, or they are destined to do specific works, like they can be tattoo artists or to work as, I don't know, anything else that is not a choice for them. And I'm still concerned. That's why I mentioned the bell jar and the bluest eye when you gendered the discussion and when you racialized the discussion, because I started thinking of Piccola as someone who can be considered a disabled person in that context because she doesn't feel she belongs, since she doesn't have blue eyes. So if she doesn't have blue eyes, she doesn't have a certain status of humanity to belong in that community or to feel beautiful. And what do you think about that? Do you think it's a good take to consider disability in this extended version?
I think it, yeah, I think it is. I mean, I do think it is. At the same time, I think, as with animal studies too, that those who are keenly focused on the body would say, let's also keep our eye on the body. But I think that disability is so focused on culture and society that if bodies are not allowed because they're a certain color or they're a certain gender or they're a certain sexual orientation, that I don't see how you cannot talk. And I mean, look at Piccola Bluest Eye. She doesn't have blue eyes. Is that not really a commentary on eugenics, right? And, you know, not fitting. And if ugliness is part of the list of disabilities, and if there's a certain kind of norm, does not that fit? And so, and then if the body is weak and can't perform certain functions, does that not fit in a world that seems to be designed for white 23-year-old, perfectly able-bodied men? So I think that it's almost impossible if you have that sort of perspective not to keep that in mind. And as you were talking, I didn't bring up this one point, but it's something that I think about. In the disability rights movement, the word pride is used, and there's a lot of emphasis on empowerment, and we are powerful together. And so, let us wear or let us occupy our bodies with pride. But let's also not forget that other disabilities are chronic pain and real physical suffering. So and also when you're going through depression, that is no fun, right? So don't underestimate, the kinds of experiences that people have and the suffering that goes along with precarity and not knowing where you're going to sleep and where you're going to eat. And the kind of constant terrorism that trans people live in our extremely heteronormative world. I mean, it is terrorism. You never know where the next act of violence is going to come. And so it's terrifying to, be in that place. I mean, I listen to a radio show called Democracy Now!, which tends to focus on all the causes that I like. And so a number of the shows are about being, a part of the LGBTQ plus community, and the deaths. I mean, the number of people who are killed is shocking, just shocking and horrific. So I think you're absolutely right, Victoria. I think you do need to, I think with this kind of perspective, you are going to think about other dimensions. Yeah, I don't know if that helps, but I would concur.
Yes, it does. I was thinking about that because when you said that in some debates, the debates are centered on in the body dimensions, body perspectives, but when you talk about racialized bodies, transgendered bodies, it's about the body, right? Like they're not just about sexual orientation, but in a biological dimension when some people are prevented from performing some tasks because they don't perform a certain gender the way it should be, this oppressive regime of performing a certain gender, but it's concerned with the genitals, right? It's about the body. So this misfunction between body and performance prevents someone from performing some tasks. So that's why I was thinking about that.
Yeah, and I don't know what happens in Brazil, but many babies are born with whose genitals don't quite match up. And so doctors routinely perform surgeries to make sure that, oh, this is a girl. Let's make sure she doesn't have even the slightest hint of a penis. And so you can see how even the medical profession is still informed by eugenics, right? If eugenics says we are either men or women, boys or girls, they make sure they get right in there and they perform these surgeries to normalize that heteronormative body. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeanne. And there is another comment. Nasada, would you like to comment on this?
Yes, actually, I was writing because I was trying to not forget this comment. Because when you are talking about the blue sky, it reminds me A Hora da Estrela by Clarice Lispector, and the way that Macabea sees herself as a person who doesn't belong in society, the same as Pecola in this case.
Yeah, and isn't one of the things, these are two different worlds, and it's so great too to compare two texts from two different worlds with each other to get students to see the similarities across cultures and the differences. And yeah, I think what a great pairing and great authors too. You know, Clarice Lispector is quite popular in the US, right? I mean, I think that she's probably one of the most famous Brazilian authors. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, she's so incredible. Awesome. Yeah.
So guys, if you have any more questions, please write them down. So Jeanne, would you like to comment a little bit more on Perkins' poem?
I think that, well, in a way, I think that it connects to what you are saying, that that society determines which bodies fit into the mainstream. And so, again, in a patriarchal world, being a woman is kind of a disease. I mean, one of the things I did when I first started moving into women's studies is I thought it's not enough to stay in the academy. I must do something. So I became a volunteer for a victim rights organization. So women who were battered and abused by their husbands had to, some of them would appear in court. And so I was there just to provide support and so on. I had to go through an extensive training for that. And one of the things I learned, this is so horrible, but men who batter, they will especially go after their partners when they are pregnant, and they deliberately target their bellies. This is a very harsh topic. I should have given a trigger warning. And so I guess that when I see this poem, I can't help but think that as men are battering, I can't help but sort of think about, what kind of are they trying to kill, I mean, obviously it's about violence and domination, but it seems so sick to me. Are they trying to kill something in themselves? And it's hard for me. I mean, I'm bringing, readers bring things to poems. It's hard for me not to think about, trying to, like that Professor Von X in A Room of One's Own, trying to stab out that insect, his hatred for women. And I guess I'm just kind of reminded of this kind of hatred of the other and the kind of violence behind that. And in a way, for me, teaching literature is about, getting students to kind of be aware of these cultural constructs, being mindful and speaking out, speaking to each other, and appreciating the authors who get us to sort of see things that we may not be able to talk about in such overt ways. But I think, looking at this poem, looking at the next poem, which is a much happier kind of poem about, writing, but it's also using disability as a device. And here I think that this is more head on talking about disability. But I just think literature has that power to make us aware of things that I think we should be aware of as human beings. and strive toward a better world where, these kinds of imbalances and this kind of violence does not take place.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeanne. I think you are providing excellent teaching tips for our teachers here. This is the most important part, I believe, to make our students aware. And awareness is going to help them in the classroom, for sure.
Well, I'm really delighted to be talking with fellow teachers too, and how to teach. I'm always striving for that. My great quest now is how to teach in the age of Chat GPT. And then I think, does Chat help students with disabilities, or does it, get in the way of the writing process, etc.? But I think we're all always, and this is for all the young people, especially Ingrid, Jeanne, and Anna Sara, but your teachers never, ever quite feel like they've got it. We're always trying to do a better job of teaching the text so we can reach you. And we're always having to change because the world keeps changing, and you keep changing, and your awareness keeps changing. Yeah. Thank you, Eduarda. Is there, sorry, I'm reading it too. I'll let the co-host read the question for me. Sorry about that.
Okay, so Eduardo is saying, as an English teacher, is there any recommendation of modern literature that brings up those awareness about the portrayal or disabilities that could work with teenagers?
Yeah, Eduarda, I have, there's John Steinbeck, who I think did a nice job with disabilities, but I'm thinking of contemporary examples that, and I don't know if you're looking for young adult literature. As it turns out, I'm married to somebody who teaches young adult literature, and who also trains high school English teachers, works with teacher candidates is what we call them. And I'm going to ask him to give me a list, because he has a list, and I could email that to you. So if you send me your email address, I can email that to you. I think I had some text on that list of canonical examples. But I think that there are examples of books from around the world, and I don't know if you're looking for canonical or young adult, U.S., Brazilian, African, sub-Saharan African, Anglophone, Francophone, Lusophone. But if you want to give me a list of the kinds of texts that you get to teach, and I think clips of movies and films, I like to integrate those to, like, showing some of Frida Kahlo art. We don't just have to teach literary texts. We can incorporate short videos and art and other kinds of clips, and certainly graphic fiction.
Mm-hmm.
So just email me, and I can send you and specify what kinds of texts you're looking for, and I'll work with Andrew and see what we can find out.
Because these students, they are about to graduate, like in 1 year or so.
Oh, congratulations.
And they are really anxious about the classroom, how they can be critical and how they can be inclusive, considering literature, English. And it's a very common question. They in general, they ask me what books they can use in the classrooms, especially because in many schools here in Brazil, censorship is very common.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I read about that.
It's very common. So in general, private schools worse, but it also happens in public schools that some books are censored because they approach directly some issues that can be considered sensitive issues or ideological issues, such as race, gender, And recently, a book by Jefferson Tenório, a Brazilian author, was censored because he approached issues of race. And Judith Butler has just been censored here in Brazil because of the cover of her book. And so it's a very common issue here, unfortunately.
Yeah, I actually read an article about how Brazil is also facing terrible backlash against diversity, equity, inclusion. And we have heard about Judith Butler as well. So one recommendation would be to, if you cannot choose texts that face issues and that work with issues head on, if you can't choose that kind of text, find a canonical text that, doesn't get censored by those attacking DEI. In fact, I would say those who are in support of monocultures and similarity, exclusion, or DEI, diversity, equity, inequity, and exclusion. Those who are for those the three opposites, and find canonical texts that have disability, that do where you could talk about disability, race, gender, and so on. And you can still bring it up in the classroom, but in a more oblique way. I mean, just call attention to it. So that might be something. And you also mentioned a text about rape. I would have to include that on the list of disability, because overcoming that kind of trauma can be a lifelong process, and it's horrible and it's disabling. And so this is where trauma studies would absolutely fit in to disability studies. Yeah. In fact, I just read an extended essay in the New York Times about a woman who experienced a traumatic situation. And she said, stop saying that you get over it. Sometimes you just never do, or it takes a long time. Don't underestimate the power of trauma. So, yeah. But as far as the selection of texts goes, I mean, look at John Steinbeck, canonical U.S. writer. You can use, that as an opportunity to talk about something that you would talk about with texts that face these issues more head on.
Thank you, Jeanne. I don't believe we have more questions. So, Ingrid, Masara?
I would just want to say thank you for the invited. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time here, so I'm kind of nervous. But it was a pleasure. I really love to meet you.
Yes, I said it was a pleasure to meet you. It was a pleasure to be invited here. It's also my first time mediating an event like this, so I feel very honored to be able to participate and to learn so much from you and from all the other professors and our students too as well.
You did a fabulous job. You were pros. So if you hadn't said that, one would never know.
Thank you so much. Thank Professor Victor and all the professors too.
Thank you. So now a little bit of Portuguese. Então, pessoal, nós estamos encerrando a sessão de hoje e amanhã nós temos o último dia de minicurso da professora Jeanne Dubino. Ela vai falar um pouco sobre programas de extensão, principalmente com relação à sua experiência ao redor do mundo, que ela visitou muitos países, e eu acho que é uma boa oportunidade, principalmente para professores de língua inglesa. E professores de língua inglesa em formação também. Então, amanhã nós teremos, no mesmo horário, às 8 horas da manhã, horário do Acre, e às 10 horas da manhã, horário de Brasília, a nossa última session. Então, lembrando que para ganhar certificação, precisa ter pelo menos 2 dias de presença. Ok? So, Maisa is here, Jeanne.
Thank you, Maisa.
Yes, you did a great job, girls. Thank you so much. So, Jeanne, thank you so much for being here today with us, sharing all your expertise, your knowledge on these interesting subjects. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. Thank you, Ana Sara, Ingrid, for this, as Jeanne said, fabulous job. And see you all tomorrow.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye. Thank you.